Thank you. Yes, I will introduce our next speaker is Jaimie McEvoy. Um, Jaimie McEvoy is an author, historian, and four-term city councillor in New Westminster, BC, near Vancouver. First elected in 2008, Jaimie is chair of the city's Affordable Housing Advisory Committee and chair of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing. Working together with the local chapter of ACORN, Jaimie successfully introduced the first municipal living wage policy in Canada. Prior to being elected, Jaimie worked as the director for a United Church project to provide a variety of assistance to clients of the food bank, which included running a homelessness prevention program that assisted people and intervened to prevent people from becoming homeless. Jaimie currently provides local citizens with a newsletter on the state of the pandemic. In New Westminster, he is best known for his love of cats. That's great. Yes, I love cats too, Jaimie. It's really great. Welcome, Jaimie, and it's our pleasure to have you from our ACORN members. We're really excited to hear from you.
Thank you. So many years ago, can you hear me okay, by the way? Okay, good. Many years ago, as an average citizen, I booked an appointment at City Hall to ask, what are the city's environmental policies? So why do I mention that? Well, I mention it because I got the same answers that people are being told about housing today. I was told there aren't any policies. I was told that it would be impossible, that it's not our jurisdiction, that there was no way it could be done. I was even told it would be illegal. But today, nearly every city has some sustainability in environmental policies and practices in place. When I was first elected in 2008, New Westminster was just beginning to draft an affordable housing policy. And I was fortunate because my election was the one that created a majority in favor of that. But that policy at that time was more about what the city would not do than what it would. So we began addressing the housing crisis in small ways at first, but it got worse. The housing crisis got worse. Apartment buildings that had been owned by individuals, sometimes for 30, 40 years, started to be bought up by entities that were more interested in the revenue than the housing, and less interested in the individual tenants who lived there and what their circumstances were. In BC, we have a degree of rent control as long as the tenant lives there. When a tenant moves out, the rent can be increased to any level. So some landlords saw that loophole and we began to have a real renoviction crisis. Renovations just for the sake of forcing tenants out to take advantage of that loophole. In some of those cases, repairs were needed. But I asked people, think about it. Did the tenants really have to be forced to move out? And we did a review as a city, we did a review of our building permits. We looked at building permits for strata and condominiums, and we looked at the building permits for rental buildings. And what we learned was that when people owned the apartment, they almost never had to move out for the same work to be done that renters were being forced out almost every time. And some of those renovations were small things. Replace a countertop, call it a renovation and evict the tenant. One case, it was painting a bathroom. One clever building owner replaced the building's boiler in the summertime and evicted 13 floors of tenants on the grounds that they would have no heat while the boiler was being replaced in July. And sometimes a landlord just lied and no renovations were done after the evictions had happened. So we wanted to make change, but we were frustrated. Cities operate under provincial law, and we had no legal right, for example, to withhold or deny building permits. This idea, this fatalism, was largely accepted in our cities, the idea that there's just nothing we could do. So we decided, and we actually decided formally, we're going to change our mindset and we're going to change our instructions to our staff. And we said, let's find out what we can do. We might be the first, so let's think outside of the box, but we're not going to accept any more that we can't do anything. So let's start thinking, what is that way? Our position and our instructions to our staff were we are going to do something. We didn't know what it was, but it was a pretty big change in how people approached the issue and how people thought. We couldn't figure out how to deal with the building permits. We did introduce some processes that helped with that, but we couldn't figure out a legal way. But we do have the power to license business, and we have the power to regulate business licenses. And so that's what we did. And when you think about it, historically, rental housing has always been a business. The only business, though, that doesn't require a license to be in business. Most of our rental housing was now owned by registered corporations. Why shouldn't they have a business license? This is in fact their business. They say so themselves. So on February 5th, 2019, we adopted the Business Regulations and Licensing Rental Units Bylaw, Bylaw 83110, Bylaw 8310, 2019, if anyone wants to look it up. This bylaw controls how building owners can undertake renovations and places restrictions on evictions. We have a Residential Tenancy Act in BC, and we were careful that no part of the licensing bylaw conflicted with the Tenancy Act. In fact, we effectively made it so respecting the Tenancy Act was a condition of having the business license. Violations of the bylaw are subject to fines of $500 to $1,000. That doesn't sound like much when you get to change the rent on an apartment. So we had to make sure that any enforcement would be effective. So those fines can be levied every single day. A landlord can face a new $500 to $1,000 fine every single day that they are not complying with the business license regulations. Ultimately, we could withdraw the business license, and because the business license is required, that landlord would no longer be allowed to rent units. I mean, that would be the far end of enforcement because we understand that could impact tenants as well. But if we had a situation where we had a real slumlord and a dangerous building and they were really just harming tenants, we could actually remove their right to continue to rent to people. Our bylaw was challenged in court. And whenever I talk to people in other jurisdictions, I always hear this argument about the legality. I'm not aware of a jurisdiction in Canada where cities don't have some right to license and regulate business. We were the first. So we knew, we were very careful and very deliberate. We knew it was important to have a bylaw that would hold up in court. And a year after the bylaw was adopted, on 11th February 2020, just in time for the pandemic, the Business Regulations and Licensing Rental Units Bylaw was held up in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. The court dismissed the petition on a number of grounds, but really a rather simple ground ruled that the bylaw was in fact within the city's powers. So the legal question and the legal issue was settled a year after we adopted our bylaw. We had threats from builders, we had threats from developers that they would never again build in New Westminster. But none of that ever happened. And it didn't actually come from builders who were building in New Westminster or had a relationship with the city. But that threat did concern our council, and it caused a lot of other councillors in BC to hesitate, but it never happened. Nothing ever came of it. Once the bylaw was in place, it was just another fact of life. And in fact, we had some builders of rental housing who were feeling frustrated with the city's lack of policy. Felt like they had to wheel and deal with the planning department every time they did something. And so we actually had some who were thankful that we adopted some clear policy. And we provide support. When a landlord wants to make renovations, our City Department of Development Services and our building department works with them on how that can happen with minimal impact on tenants, just as we already did with condo buildings. If a tenant does have to be moved out, the licensing bylaw requires the landlord to provide alternative accommodation to the tenant so the tenant can move back in at the same rent they were paying before. We also did some things with our zoning powers as well. We had an overall package in addition to our rental units bylaw. We adopted a rental replacement policy. That means that any rental units lost to development must be replaced by the developer as part of the development. So there's not a lot of incentive in buying a 3-story building to tear it down to build a new 3-story building. You can't, you have to have it, you have to replace the rental units. And this has effectively limited dim evictions. We haven't had any dim evictions in New Westminster. And part of that also is because we have a policy not to allow higher buildings to be built in place of the buildings that were torn down. We have height restrictions, which any city can do. So there's no incentive to buy a 3-story building, tear it down, and think you're going to build a 12 or a 30-story building, because that just won't be allowed. We do have a carrot to the stick. We created a rental revitalization tax exemption. So if an owner needs to make significant renovations, but they agree to have a covenant on title that they will not renovate, the city will give them a little bit of tax break for a while. We also use our planning process to get more rental built. It's actually a simple formula. We have building heights up to a certain height. The developers typically want a greater height, so they can, and if they include affordable housing or rental housing, they can ask for the buildings to be built taller. It's a pretty simple mechanism. And sometimes we just ask. We have a tenant displacement policy. If a developer has bought a building with tenants and that building absolutely needs to be demolished or have a full renovation, we actually have one building in this circumstance that's getting close to a state of collapse. We require the developer to be absolutely sure that every tenant is successfully relocated. This is something that's always bothered me. We don't know what happens with the tenants. Nobody does, and so nobody has to take responsibility. And so we required this company to do this, and they actually came up with the idea that they were going to hire a tenant coordinator whose job it was to track every single tenant and make sure that the tenants had new affordable housing that had to move. So the outcome is that there have been no mass renovictions since we applied the bylaw. We were getting to a point of having a dozen or more a year. Before that crisis, it would be a bad year if we had 2 or 3 fully renovated buildings. So we've had none since adopting the bylaw. I don't know if people are interested in the legal argument, but I can tell you a little bit about it, and I can send information. But basically, the courts ruled that the city has a right to adopt a bylaw. The city has a right to adopt a bylaw for whatever reasons it wants to, as long as it's within the city's powers. The court ruled that every councillor gave 12 different reasons for why they want the bylaw. As long as one of those reasons is legally valid, the bylaw is still valid. The petitioner was going to argue that they're not a business, but they saw no legal path forward in making that argument. And in fact, the court dealt with it anyway. And the court just said very clearly, this is a business. Cities have the right to regulate business. And case law has said that the word business has a fairly broad application to it. And that case law would apply anywhere in Canada. So like anywhere else, we can't adopt a bylaw that contravenes provincial law, but we can overlap with provincial law. And so our bylaw allows us to effectively be another mechanism of enforcement for the Residential Tenancy Act. Even though it's outside of our jurisdiction, we're not allowed to contradict that act, but we are allowed to overlap provincial law. And so there's other things that we did as a city, but I think that gives you a bit of an outline. We made sure we hired social planning and housing staff. We have a tenant displacement bylaw. If the city has an enforcement action that results in tenants having to move, the city itself takes responsibility for finding those tenants new housing. And we're currently working on projects where we've made city land available for social housing projects. So that's an outline. I'll be glad to take questions later.
Great, thank you, Jaimie, so much. Bravo for like you and everyone that you've talked to. You have, I'm sure, saved a lot of tenants, and yeah, it's really great to have